17-year-old Kevin Ives and 16-year-old Don Henry were struck by a train near Alexander. The medical examiner has said that the boys were asleep and drugged with marijuana. The parents, however, disputed that claim and persuaded authorities to reopen the case.
There are certain cases that don't just stay in the past, they fester. They bleed out from the moment of impact, infecting the years that follow, staining the reputation of entire towns, and casting a shadow over the justice system itself. Usually, when we talk about unsolved deaths, we are looking for a killer. We are looking for a name, a face, or motive. But in the case of Don Henry and Kevin Ives, the search for a killer revealed something much darker than a single violent individual. It revealed a mechanism, a system designed not to solve crimes, but to bury them. Two popular high school boys go hunting late one night. They never come home. They are found dead on the railroad tracks, run over by a 75-car freight train. The authorities call it an accident. Then they call it suicide. Then they simply stop talking. What happened on the tracks in Alexander, Arkansas wasn't just a tragedy. It was the opening chapter of one of the most convoluted conspiracies in American history. Rabbit hole involving drug smuggling, political cover-ups, and a body count that kept rising long after the boys were buried. This is the story of the boys on the tracks. To understand the sheer impossibility of the official narrative, you have to look at the timeline. It's shortly after 3 a.m. on August 23, 1987. A Union Pacific train, led by a crew that had made this run 100 times, is cutting through the darkness of Salem County. They are moving at roughly 52 miles per hour. Engineer Stephen Schroyer is watching the rails. At this speed, a train this size, 3 locomotives, 75 cars, weighing thousands of tons, takes over a mile to come to a complete stop. Schroyer sees something ahead, about a quarter mile out. At first, it looks like debris, maybe discarded lumber or a tarp left by workers. As the distance closes, the shape resolves. It's not lumber. It's 2 human beings. They are lying on the tracks, not across them, like someone tied down in a movie, but parallel, lying between the rails, motionless. Royer slams the emergency brakes. The screech of metal on metal is deafening, sending sparks flying into the dry brush. He lays on the horn, a wall of sound that would wake the dead. But the boys don't move. They don't flinch. They don't scramble to get up. They lie perfectly still as the train, unable to fight the laws of physics and time, passes over them. When the train finally grinds to a halt, the crew rushes back. They find the mangled remains of 17-year-old Kevin Ives and 16-year-old Don Henry. They had been out spotlighting, a local term for hunting deer at night with lights and rifles. One of their guns, a .22 caliber rifle, is found lying beside the tracks. This is where the incompetence begins, or depending on how you view this case, this is where the cleanup begins. Standard procedure for a fatality involving a train is to treat it as a crime scene until proven otherwise. You tape it off, you photograph everything, you measure the distance of the bodies, you check the soil for footprints. The Salem County Sheriff's Office did almost none of this. Officers on the scene didn't order a blood kit. They didn't check the boys' hands for gunshot residue. They didn't even photograph the bodies before they were moved. In fact, according to later testimony, one of the deputies was heard complaining that the investigation was taking too long because the train was blocking a crossing and people needed to get to work. Within an hour, the scene was cleared. The train was sent on its way. Biological evidence that was splattered on the undercarriage of the locomotive, gone, washed away at the next station. The ground where the boys lay, trampled by first responders. The initial ruling was swift. Accident. The boys, the police theorized, had fallen asleep on the tracks. Think about that for a second. Two teenage boys, best friends, out hunting. They decide to take a nap. They're in the woods, not in a deer stand, but on the gravel ballast of an active railroad track. Not only do they fall asleep on jagged rocks, but they sleep so soundly that a freight train horn, measuring 150 decibels, doesn't wake them up. They don't even twitch as a multi-ton engine bears down on them. It was a theory that insulted the intelligence of everyone in Salem County. But the families of Don and Kevin didn't know yet that the accident theory was just the tip of the iceberg. They were about to meet the man who would become the villain of this story, the state medical examiner, Dr. Fahmi Malak. Dr. Fahmi Malak is a figure who looms large over the dark history of Arkansas justice. Appointed by Governor Bill Clinton, Malak was the final word on death in the state. His word was law, and his word on the Ives and Henry case was creative. Malak conducted the autopsies. He concluded that Don and Kevin had smoked an ungodly amount of marijuana. He claimed the boys were in a marijuana-induced coma. Specifically, he stated they had smoked the equivalent of 20 marijuana cigarettes each. Now, anyone with even a passing knowledge of biology or drug use knows this is absurd. First, smoking that much cannabis would likely cause a person to vomit or pass out long before they finished. Second, marijuana is a stimulant and a hallucinogen in certain quantities, but it does not induce a coma so deep that you ignore the train horn. But Malak doubled down. He ruled the deaths accidental, caused by marijuana intoxication. The parents weren't buying it. Linda Ives, Kevin's mother, knew her son. She knew he wasn't a heavy drug user, and certainly not someone who would pass out on a train track. They demanded the toxicology reports. When independent experts looked at Malak's data, they found something shocking. The levels of THC in the boys' blood were actually quite low. One expert stated it was likely they had smoked 1 or 2 joints, perhaps hours before death, not 20, and certainly not enough to cause a coma. Malak had lied, or he was grossly incompetent. But why? Why lie about 2 dead teenagers? To understand if this was malice or stupidity, you have to look at Malak's track record. This is the same medical examiner who once ruled that a man found decapitated in his own home had died of an ulcer, and his dog had eaten his head post-mortem. It was later proven the man was murdered with a machete. Malak was protected. Despite the scandal after scandal, he kept his job. The governor's office, the state apparatus, they shielded him. But Linda Ives was a force of nature. She began a crusade. She badgered the media. She had press conferences. She made it impossible for the state to ignore the case. Because of her persistence, a grand jury was finally convened, and in 1988, nearly a year after the deaths, the bodies of Don Henry and Kevin Ives were exhumed. Exhuming a body is a traumatic experience for a family. It It's a reopening of a wound that has barely begun to scab over. But for the Ives and Henry families, it was the only path to the truth. They hired Dr. Joseph Burton, a renowned forensic pathologist from Atlanta, to conduct the second examination. What Dr. Burton found shattered the official narrative. Remember, Malak said the injuries were solely from the train, massive trauma. Burton cleaned the remains. He looked past the damage caused by the wheels, and he found wounds that the train couldn't explain. On Henry's shirt there were cuts, not tears, which happen when fabric is ripped by machinery, but clean slices, stab wounds. Burton found a stab wound in Don Henry's back. It had penetrated the muscle. But the most damning evidence came from Kevin Ives. Kevin's skull showed evidence of a depressed fracture on his face, the kind of injury you get from a rifle butt to the head. Burton's conclusion was chilling. He determined that one boy was likely stabbed and the other beaten into unconsciousness before the train ever arrived. They weren't sleeping, they were dead or dying. Someone had placed them there. The tarp. Remember, the engineer said he saw something that looked like a tarp. Dr. Burton noted that the positioning of the bodies, laid out perfectly parallel, face up, arms by their sides, was inconsistent with falling asleep. It was consistent with staging. The train wasn't the cause of death. It was the weapon used to destroy the evidence. The ruling was officially changed. The accident was gone. The suicide was gone. Now, it was probable homicide. The vindication for the parents was bitter. They were right. Their sons had been murdered. But this victory only opened the door to a much darker room. If the boys were murdered, who did it? And why did the estate medical examiner lie to cover it up? The investigation shifted. The police could no longer claim negligence. Now, they had to look for a killer. But in Second County, the line between the criminals and the law was blurry. As the grand jury began to dig, witnesses started coming forward. People who had seen things that night. People who had heard rumors. And that is when the dying started. Enter Dan Harmond, the prosecutor for the judicial district covering Second County. In the beginning, Harmond positioned himself as the champion of the parents. He was the one who was going to get to the bottom of this. He aggressively pursued the grand jury investigation. He railed against the incompetence of the initial investigation. Linda Ives initially trusted him. He seemed to be the only official willing to fight for Kevin and Don. But as the months dragged on, that trust began to erode. Witnesses who spoke to Harmond's investigators reported feeling intimidated. Leads that were given to his office seemed to vanish. And then, there was the money. Rumors had swirled for years that Salem County was a backyard for drug trafficking, specifically cocaine. The tracks where the boys died weren't just random tracks. They were known locally. But to understand why two high schoolers might be targeted by drug cartel or corrupt cops, you have to zoom out. You have to look at the Mena connection. Mena, Arkansas, a small town with an airport that in the 1980s was allegedly the hub of a massive cocaine smuggling operation run by Barry Seal. The theory, supported by multiple investigators and former law enforcement, was that planes would fly into Arkansas, drop duffel bags of drugs at specific coordinates, and ground crews would retrieve them. The tracks in Alexander were a drop zone. The working theory for the parents became terrifyingly simple. Don and Kevin were spotlighting. They were in the woods at 3 a.m. They weren't looking for drugs. They were looking for deer. But they saw something they weren't supposed to see. Maybe they saw a drop. Maybe they saw the police picking up the drop. Several witnesses reported seeing a man in military fatigues near the tracks that night. The police dismissed it. But as the grand jury probed the drug angle, Dan Harmond's behavior became erratic. He started attacking the parents in the press. He tried to shut down the investigation he had started. Why? Because, as it would later turn out, Dan Harmond wasn't just a prosecutor, he was a player. Years later, Dan Harmond would be convicted of running a drug ring from his office. He was dealing drugs to the very people he was prosecuting. He was eventually sent to federal prison. This was the man in charge of investigating the murder of the boys. The fox was guarding the henhouse, and he was making sure the hens kept quiet. In most murder cases, you have 1 or 2 victims. In a serial killer case, you might have 10 or 20 over a decade. But the Ives and Henry case is unique because of the satellite deaths. As soon as the ruling changed to homicide and the grand jury started asking questions about the tracks, people in Salem County started dying. Let's talk about Keith McCaskill. Keith was a local. He knew things. He had told friends and family that he had information about what happened on the tracks. He was terrified. He told his family that he was being followed. He believed he was on a hit list. On election night, 1988, Keith McCaskill went to a local bar. He seemed anxious. He made it home, but he never made it inside. Keith was attacked in his carport. This wasn't a robbery. His wallet was still on him. This was a message. Keith McCaskill was stabbed 113 times. 113 times. That is not a mugging. That is a frenzy, or it is a warning to anyone else who is thinking about talking. The police, they didn't solve it. They barely investigated it. And Keith was just the first. Gregory Collins, he had been subpoenaed to testify before the grand jury. He had information. Before he could testify, he was found in the woods, shot in the face with a shotgun. Ruled right? No, but still unsolved. Then there was Jeff Rhodes. Jeff Rhodes told his family he knew too much about the deaths of Ives, Henry, and McCaskill. He was trying to get out of town. In April 1989, his body was found in a dump. He had been shot in the head. His body set on fire. The condition of his remains suggested the message was clear. Silence is survival. When you look at one death, it's a tragedy. When you look at 2, it's a coincidence. When you look at 6 or 7 violent deaths, all involving people connected to the same initial crime, all happening within a tight geographic radius and all remaining unsolved, that is not a coincidence. That is a cleanup operation, and the people running the cleanup had badges. By 1990, the heat in Salem County was becoming suffocating. The deaths of witnesses like Keith McCaskill and Jeff Rhodes had sent a chill through the community. People knew that speaking out was a death sentence. But while Dan Harmond was playing the role of the crusading prosecutor in public, a new player entered the arena. a woman named Jean Duffy. Jean Duffy was appointed to head a newly formed drug task force. Her mandate was simple: clean up the drug trade in Salem County. She was given federal funding and a team of undercover officers. But almost immediately, Duffy ran into a wall, and that wall was Dan Harmon. As Duffy's agents began to infiltrate the local drug rings, the intelligence they gathered didn't point to low-level street dealers. It pointed up. Her officers reported that the drug distribution network was being protected by local law enforcement. And at the top of the pyramid, the name that kept coming up in witness statements and informant tips was Dan Harmon. Duffy was in a nightmare scenario. The man she was supposed to work with, the district prosecutor, was the very man her task force was investigating. When Duffy tried to bring this evidence to light, the system turned on her. Harmon used the local press to smear her. He claimed she was the corrupt one. He demanded the names of her undercover informants. Now ask yourself, why would the prosecutor demand the names of the undercover agents working in his own district? There is only one reason: to burn them, to expose them to the criminals they are investigating. Duffy refused. She knew that if she gave Harmon those names, her agents would end up like Kevin Ives and Don Henry, dead on the roadside or worse. The pressure became so intense, the threats against her life and her children so credible, that Jean Duffy did the only thing she could. She took the files, she packed her car, and she fled the state. The drug task force was disbanded. The files vanished into the ether, and Dan Harmon was re-elected. The message to the citizens of Salem County was reinforced: you cannot beat the house. With the task force gone, the investigation into the boys' deaths stalled again. But in the early 90s, a breakthrough came from an unlikely source: a woman named Charlene Wilson. In the local drug world, she was known as the Murder Mom. An addict, a dealer, and a police informant who ran in the same circles as Dan Harmon. In a confession that remains one of the most disturbing pieces of evidence in this case, Charlene Wilson admitted to being on the tracks that night. She wasn't just a bystander. According to Wilson, she was there with Dan Harmon and a local drug dealer named Keith McCaskill. The same Keith McCaskill who would later be stabbed 113 times. Wilson claimed that Don Henry and Kevin Ives had stumbled upon a drop. They had seen drugs being loaded. He described the scene of chaos. The boys were grabbed, and then she described the method of murder. She claimed that she, under the influence of cocaine and under the direction of the men present, used a knife on one of the boys. This is where the story gets chillingly specific. Wilson described stabbing one of the boys in the back. Remember Dr. Burton's autopsy? The one the state tried to suppress? He found a stab wound in Don Henry's back. He also found cuts in the shirt that matched the knife. Details that had never been released to the public. Details that only the killer or someone standing right next to them could have known. She also claimed the boys were wrapped in the tarp before being placed on the tracks. Why would an addict concoct a story that implicates her in a capital murder? Usually, criminals lie to minimize their involvement. Wilson was admitting to atrocities. She claimed she was terrified of Dan Harmon. He claimed he was a monster who controlled the drug trade with an iron fist. And yet, despite this confession, despite the corroborating physical evidence, Dan Harmon was not charged with murder. understand why a local prosecutor could operate with such impunity, and why the state medical examiner could falsify autopsies without consequence, we have to look at the umbrella that covered Arkansas in the 1980s. This brings us to the most controversial aspect of the case, the Mena connection. Mena, Arkansas is a tiny town, but in the 80s it was the base of operation for Barry Seal, one of the biggest drug smugglers in American history. Seal admitted to flying tons of cocaine into the US, allegedly with the tacit approval of federal agencies, who were using him to run guns to the Contras in Nicaragua. It was a geopolitics meets organized crime operation, and the flight paths, they went right over Salem County. The theory, supported by investigators like Gene Duffy and verified by former CIA contractors, is that the tracks in Alexander were a drop zone. If Don and Kevin interrupted a drop that was part of a federally protected operation, their deaths weren't just a local crime. They were a national security issue. It is where the conspiracy stops being a theory and starts looking like history. When you have the state medical examiner, Dr. Malak, ruling obvious murders as accidents, and you have the governor backing him, you have to ask why. During the height of the controversy, despite the parents' outrage, Governor Bill Clinton didn't fire Malak. In fact, Malak was given a 40% pay raise. Why give a raise to a man who says a dog ate the victim's head? Why protect a man who says two boys smoked 20 joints and fell asleep on a train track? Unless his value wasn't in his competence. Unless his value was in his ability to sign the death certificate and ask no questions. Malak was the gatekeeper. As long as he ruled accident, there was no murder investigation, no police inquiry, no federal scrutiny. The status quo remained safe. There is one final group of witnesses we haven't discussed, the men on the train. Stephen Schroyer, the engineer, saw the bodies, but there were other men on that crew. Unlike everyone else who touched this case, their lives became complicated. In the initial police reports, there were mentions of the crew seeing two men in fatigues standing near the tree line as the train passed, watching, making sure the train did its job. But these statements were buried. The crew was told to stick to the script. We saw the boys. We couldn't stop. Over the years, members of the train crew expressed fear. They received anonymous threats. They were told that what they saw in the woods that night was better left unseen. It adds another layer of horror to the event. The train wasn't just a vehicle, it was a weapon, wielded by men watching from the darkness, used to crush the bodies of two teenagers who had seen too much. The body count surrounding the boys on the tracks case is estimated to be anywhere between 6 and 12 people, depending on how deep you draw the circle. Witnesses murdered, informants vanished, suspects protected, and at the center of it all, two families who just wanted to know why. Linda Ives spent the rest of her life fighting. She sued the government. She filed FOIA requests. She wrote a book. She never stopped screaming into the void, demanding that someone acknowledge that her son was murdered. She passed away in 2021. She never got a conviction. She never saw Dan Harmond charged with the murders. He never saw the federal government admit to the Mena connection. Dan Harmond served time for drugs and racketeering. He was released. He lives as a free man. Dr. Fahmy Malak eventually moved on, his reputation in tatters, but his freedom intact. The tracks in Alexander are still there. The trains still run. This case is often cited as a conspiracy theory, but that term is used to dismiss things that are untrue. Here we have the bodies, we have the botched autopsies, we have the confession, we have the dead witnesses. This isn't a theory, it's a blueprint. It is a demonstration of what happens when a small town becomes a cog in a machine much larger than itself. When the preservation of a criminal enterprise becomes more important than the lives of two teenage boys. We may never know exactly who had the knife or who struck the blow that killed Kevin Ives, but we know who covered it up. We know who looked the other way. And in the end, the silence of the woods that night was replaced by a silence much more deafening, the silence of a justice system that refused to work. Thank you for watching. Until the next time, be safe.